All right, I'm going to get started. As you can see, I decided to rock some officially licensed U of M PowerPoint slides for today's lecture. You'll see why in a few minutes. I'm going to try to leave some room at the end of lecture for questions, because I imagine some will come up, but I may not actually leave time, and you may not have questions, so we'll see how that works. All right. So last week we concluded that our kind of introductory 4-week look at sports culture through various individual lenses. You can think of bodies as the principal raw material fed into the sports machine, and you can see the voluntary impulse to play within certain established limits and in accordance with other motivating desires or values as a kind of fuel that makes that machine run. So now we're switching units this week, beginning a new 4-week unit in which we'll look at various social aspects of sports culture. I think you can think of these as large structural components of the sports machine, like gears or engines, conveyor belts, and the like, that transform that combination of raw materials and fuel into the products of global sports culture. You could say that all the structural components that we'll be looking at through social lenses over the next 4 weeks organize the stuff that flows into the sports machine. And it's because of that organizing function of these structural components that I wanted to start by talking about organizations. So, as a general term, organization refers to a social unit of individuals joined together to meet a need or pursue collective goals. I want to emphasize the last part of that definition, which refers to the practical purpose of organizations. So I want you to see organizations as instruments or tools forged to achieve a purpose. In fact, the very word organization comes from the ancient Greek word organon, which just meant exactly that, an instrument or a tool. Across the landscape of global sports cultures, a wide variety of organizations exist to meet many different needs and to pursue many different kinds of goals. Some, like professional sports leagues, are commercial organizations of sports team owners who have joined together to sell athletic competition as a product in the entertainment industry. Others, like a local municipal youth soccer association, are nonprofit organizations comprising families and others interested in providing participatory opportunities for youth in the community. Still others, like FIFA, emerged to fulfill a perceived need for a centralized international authority to govern competition and competitors in their sports. Despite this great variety in the size and scope of organizations in the global sports machine, they all have a connection to values. They are all, in a sense, tools or instruments built by their creators to safeguard or promote certain values they shared. In this way, and this is kind of my working definition for us, in this way, organizations within the sports machine can be seen as specialized structures of varying scales built to transform the raw materials we feed into the sports machine and to channel those in certain directions. Now, the sheer size of the role played by organizations in global sports cultures and their tremendous variety in size and purpose make it very challenging to talk about them in any comprehensive way, particularly in the short amount of time we've got in this course. So I decided to focus on a single American organization that I imagine plays a very important role in your lives, perhaps more important than any other in the sports machine. An organization about which you probably have some strong feelings and opinions, and certainly one which impacts you whether you know or care about it or not. I'm talking about the National Collegiate Athletic Association, or NCAA. It might seem strange in a course on global sports cultures to focus on an American organization, especially since our way of incorporating sports into higher education and our obsession with college sports strikes most sports fans abroad as peculiar. But I'm hoping that by introducing a discussion of the NCAA in this context, you can begin to experience it as somewhat peculiar yourselves. The first step in being able to think critically about anything in our world is to see that thing as peculiar in some ways, or unnatural, that it wasn't handed down to us by God. When we see things in our world with these fresh eyes, we can remember that they were made by human beings, and so that they can be unmade or changed by human beings. Unmade or changed by human beings like you and me. But to form an educated opinion about an organization, we need, as we would with any other tool, to understand what it's for, where it came from, and how it actually works. Only then can we judge whether we support its aims, and if we do support them, whether we think it's adequately fulfilling them. That's where I want to get you this week. So to do that, we're going to start right here with the NCAA's own declaration of what it is for: the well-being and lifelong success of college athletes. Of course, like most organizational mission statements for public consumption, this one's a little bit vague. Fortunately, the NCAA also spells out its purpose in the first article of its Constitution: to maintain intercollegiate athletics as an integral part of the educational program and the athlete as an integral part of the student body, and by so doing, retain a clear line of demarcation between intercollegiate athletics and professional sports. We'll come back to that mission from time to time today. For now, I want to kind of take you through the story of how this particular instrument or tool, the NCAA, was made and why. So to understand the NCAA today, you've got to go back a long ways and understand the role of sports in American colleges and universities in the mid-1800s, so 170 years ago or so. At that time, athletics were still frowned upon as a morally suspect waste of time in much of American society. You have already learned about the rise of muscular Christianity in the second half of the 19th century, and influenced by this movement, a younger generation of male students at prominent institutions like Yale, Harvard, Cornell, Chicago, Princeton, and Michigan began in the 1850s and 60s to organize extracurricular clubs around shared interests in sports like rowing, boxing, baseball, rugby, and eventually, and above all, American football. Though initially tolerant of such activities, alumni, faculty, and college and university presidents nevertheless had some reservations about the effects of these increasingly time-consuming extracurriculars on the moral virtues and educational growth of these young men. So, to protect their activities against the growing threat of restrictive oversight, college athletes and their supporters presented their athletic participation in terms of what was known as the amateur ideal, referring to the free participation in athletic activity for its own sake and as a means of holistic development. This concept of amateurism had been developed in 19th century England by upper-class sportsmen who based it on the false belief that ancient Greek athletes had competed without financial compensation. Authorized by this fabrication, wealthy Victorians invoked the amateur ideal to avoid competing with working-class rugby players, cricketers, boxers, and rowers who, of course, could not afford to play for nothing. In the words of historian Alan Gutman, amateurism was invented as an instrument of class warfare. In the United States, amateurism initially provided a kind of moral cover, making the incorporation of athletics into colleges socially acceptable. And it was under the cover of this moral ideal that college sports, especially football, grew rapidly over the course of the late 19th century, So that a quarter century before there was this, when Michigan was still playing at Regents Field before a few thousand fans, there was this. Harvard Field was constructed in 1903 to accommodate 31,000 fans. The price tag of a little over $8 million of today's dollars was covered by past and projected future ticket sales and a $2.6 million alumni donation. It might seem extravagant, but already in 1903, just a few decades after a handful of students at Princeton and Rutgers had organized themselves to square off in the first college football game ever, college football was king, and it was big business. In fact, Harvard and Yale blazed a trail, as they have in so many other areas of American higher education, by introducing big money, dubious recruiting practices, and academic fraud into college sports. Yale, for example, bypassed admission standards so that this man, 25-year-old standout captain James Hogan, could enroll in the school and compete for the football team. Yale not only paid Hogan's tuition, but put him up in a luxurious dorm suite, awarded him all the profits from sales of game day programs, and arranged for him to receive a commission from the American Tobacco Company on every pack of cigarettes sold in the city of New Haven. Other schools aspiring to field competitive football teams similarly offered various forms of financial compensation to attract star athletes. Here at Michigan, controversy surrounded the recruiting practices of football coach Fielding Yost, who was accused of paying players who were not actually students at the university. Even fans among Michigan's alumni at the time wrote that football posed a danger, quote, to the minds and morals of the players and their fellow students, close quote. But Professor of Greek Albert Pattengill came to Yost's defense. Pattengill, who as a student at Michigan years before actually selected blue and maize as the colors of the university, was in 1903 also the chairman of the university's recently established Board of Athletic Control. He wrote of Coach Yost, quote, "It must be said that the greatest sin we can lay at his door is that for 2 seasons he has led Michigan's team to victory. He is a man of good personal habits and enthusiastic in his work. He exercises a wholesome influence over the young men under him." Close quote. Be that as it may, college sports at the turn of the last century was, effectively, a professional enterprise operating within colleges and universities, sometimes supporting, but more often at odds with the educational mission of those institutions. Some faculty, a few college presidents, and some alumni protested these practices as contrary to that educational mission. But many were also avid cheerleaders for their school's sports teams, and most in the general public ignored them. Besides, coaches, even those who were paying players under the table, loudly proclaimed the sanctity of amateur athletic competition and its importance to the educational experience of young men. It seems that most people with a stake in college sports only objected to its commercial aspects when their sports teams were unsuccessful in bids to recruit the best players and coaches. But if college football at the dawn of the 20th century was already a big business, it was also a brutal, sometimes deadly business, as you can see in this film made by the inventor Thomas Edison of a 1903 matchup in Chicago between the University of Michigan and its then arch-rival, the University of Chicago. Players wore little padding, and many used no protective headgear. Games were 70 minutes long, and players played on almost every play on both sides of the ball. Serious injuries were common, and deaths increasingly frequent. Unlike unethical recruitment practices and commercialization, the lethal effects of football did attract attention. First, in heartbreaking media stories of parents watching from the stands as their sons died on the field before their eyes, and then in calls from the general public for the abolition of the sport. The outcry reached a fever pitch during the 1905 season when, depending on how you count, anywhere from 13 to 21 players died as a direct result of playing football. On October 9th, 1905, the very day that the first reported fatality of that season occurred, President Theodore Roosevelt summoned representatives of Yale, Harvard, and Princeton to the White House. Roosevelt was himself a Harvard graduate who had played football as an undergrad in the 1870s. He subscribed to the ideals of muscular Christianity and firmly believed that football played an essential educational role in fostering what he saw as masculine virtues of aggressiveness, toughness, competitiveness, and fair play. And so he was concerned to see the media and public opinion nationwide tending towards the elimination of football from educational institutions, like his alma mater, Harvard. From that October meeting of the so-called Big Three, the Intercollegiate Rules Committee was born. 2 months later, at a second meeting that also included football powerhouses Chicago, Cornell, and Navy, the group became the American Football Rules Committee. Meanwhile, around the same time, a second, larger reform-oriented rules committee organized that was comprised of representatives from nearly 70 institutions. Then, in January 1906, as the football abolition movement grew alongside the sport's death toll, Roosevelt called for the two different committees to come together to institute the reforms desperately needed to save the sport. The two different committees met and agreed, in the face of resistance from some traditionalists, to cooperate in implementing rules changes designed to reduce the force of collisions. They called themselves the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States. But in 1911, at their convention, they would change the name to the National Collegiate Athletic Association, or NCAA. At its founding, the NCAA's stated purpose was the regulation and supervision of collegiate athletics throughout the United States so that they can be maintained on an ethical plane in keeping with the dignity and high purpose of education. Member institutions were to prohibit the payment of athletes, require that they take a full schedule of classes, and remain in good academic standing. But the organization had no means to compel institutions to abide by these principles, and many schools at which football in particular was already a lucrative enterprise either did not join or joined but ignored the rules. So that between its creation in 1905 and the time of the Second World War, the NCAA's only area of national authority was in stipulating the rules by which the various sports would be played and organizing national championship competitions. Various mechanisms in its constitution and bylaws preserved for individual institutions and conferences the autonomy to implement or not, as they saw fit, reform measures related to the institutional role and practices of college sports. And the result was a patchwork of practices and policies throughout the country. Within the world of American college sports in the middle of the 20th century, the amateur ideal was simply not compelling enough on its own to ensure the compliance with its norms of individuals and institutions who were making good money off the under-the-table professionalization of college sports. And so, by the late 1940s, the NCAA was still a small, mostly powerless organization housed in a single one-room suite in Chicago's LaSalle Hotel. But all that would change as a result of two seemingly unrelated events engineered by this man, Walter Byers, who was the head of the organization at the time. Byers succeeded in 1952 in securing for the NCAA the exclusive right to negotiate television broadcasting contracts. Overpowering resistance from some colleges, Byers got NBC to pay the NCAA over $1 million, about $10 million in today's dollars, for the rights to televise a dozen college games per week. Around the same time, in the words of Byers himself, the NCAA, quote, crafted the term student athlete to diffuse the dreaded notion that NCAA athletes could be identified as employees by state industrial commissions and the courts. According to Byers, the term was soon mandated in all NCAA rules and interpretations as a substitute for such words as players and athletes. This concept of the student athlete was first invoked as the basis for a 1957 Colorado Supreme Court ruling that the widow of Fort Lewis A&M player Ray Dennison, who died of a head injury while playing for the school's team several years earlier, was not entitled to workers' compensation benefits because he had not been an employee, but rather a student athlete. At the core, the NCAA had been ineffectual as a national organization because institutions had no material incentive to comply with its regulations. All that changed when the NCAA acquired the power over television revenues and simultaneously enshrined the principle of amateurism through the legal concept of the student athlete. Empowered by these developments, by 1956, Byers convinced the NCAA's members to approve, for the first time, a binding nationwide policy of athletic scholarships. It simultaneously authorized schools to recruit and compensate students based on athletic ability, and at the same time gave the organization the authority to prohibit any other form of compensation it deemed as violating the amateur or collegiate ideal. The stage was set for the rapid transformation of the organization into the powerhouse that it is today. And perhaps nothing symbolizes that transformation more than this. But in more concrete terms, the NCAA today controls nearly $1 billion in annual revenues and the athletic activities of 500,000 athletes at over 1,000 institutions, all in the name of maintaining intercollegiate athletics as an integral part of the educational program and the athlete as an integral part of the student body, and by so doing, retaining a clear line of demarcation between intercollegiate athletics and professional sports. So now we have an organization, the NCAA, and its purpose. We know something about how it came into being and why. What we want to ask next is how well it's working. So to examine this, I want to follow the logic of the NCAA's own statement of purpose, that is. It wants athletics to be integral to education. And as it says, by doing so as a result of that, to keep clear the difference between college and pro sports. So I'm going to look first at how well it's supporting the educational mission of its member institutions, and then at how well it's keeping the forces of professional sports out of intercollegiate athletics. So we're going to start with education. It's going to be a lot of numbers. According to the NCAA and many others, the ultimate goal of the college experience is graduation. Therefore, one of the main measures of educational success is graduation rates. Now, by federal law, all colleges and universities that offer athletic-related aid and receive federal support are required to report student graduation rates to the Department of Education. The NCAA has been using this data for 25 years to calculate a figure it calls graduation success rate, or GSR. Its most recent data for 2016 shows a GSR for Division I athletes of 86%. That's up from 74% just a little over a decade ago. The NCAA attributes this rise in part to academic reforms it implemented around that time as part of its academic performance program, which includes penalties for schools that perform poorly in this and other academic areas. However, the NCAA calculates its graduation rate differently than does the federal government. The federal graduation rate, or FGR, reflects the percentage of students, athletes and non-athletes, who graduate within 6 years from the school where they are initially enrolled as a full-time student. The NCAA's GSR excludes athletes who leave school prior to graduating and includes athletes who transfer into a program, contending that this better captures, and these are the NCAA's words, better captures the true student-athlete academic success. Now, according to Dr. Richard Southall, who is the director of the College Sport Research Institute at the University of South Carolina, each of these numbers, GSR and FGR, capture a different aspect of institution success in graduating its students. But for him, what is more important is establishing a statistically valid basis for comparison between athletic graduation rates and those of a genuinely comparable pool of students from the general student body. To accomplish this, he developed what he calls the Adjusted Graduation Gap, or AGG. It measures the difference in graduation rates between Division I athletes and their non-athlete counterparts. So to do so, it adjusts the federal graduation rate to account for transfers, like the NCAA's number does. However, because the NCAA athletes must be enrolled full-time, it also adjusts the federal graduation rate to exclude part-time students, something that is not considered in the NCAA's comparative data. This matters because studies show that part-time students have higher dropout rates. So including them in comparisons, as does the NCAA in its GSR calculations, will create a misleadingly low impression of the general graduation rates for full-time students. So the NCAA regularly claims that its athletes graduate at higher rates than the general student body. When you make the adjustments done by Dr. Southall, here's what it looks like. So from this point of view, questions might arise about what might be going on in the educational experience of athletes that lead 20% fewer of them to graduate than their non-athlete peers. And the numbers become a little more troubling when they are broken down by race and gender, at least if you hold that diversity and equity are important values within education. Investigating these disparities, researchers frequently focus on two factors that distinguish the athlete's experience at college from their non-athletic counterparts. The first, which I shared with you, I think, last week, involves time demands. NCAA regulations limit the number of hours that may be spent per week on athletic activities to 20 in season and 8 out of season. However, coaches regularly exploit loopholes to circumvent the spirit of these regulations. So-called voluntary or optional weight training or film sessions, captain's practices, medical treatment, none of these count toward the 20 hours. So that, according to the NCAA's own data, as you see here, athletes can spend up to twice as many hours on their athletic activities as the NCAA allows. The other issue that may be affecting athletes' educational experience is known as clustering, whereby unusual proportions of athletes wind up in the same courses or majors. Though the reasons behind the phenomenon are unclear, some investigations, at least, have turned up evidence that athletes are steered, sometimes with coercive pressure, into certain courses or majors by coaches and academic advisors in an effort to ensure that their studies will not require too much time and that they will meet academic eligibility standards set by the NCAA, their conference, and their particular institution. So given this combination of pressures, it's not surprising that athletes are not, in fact, graduating at the same rate as their non-athletic peers. But an equally worrisome effect of both time demands and clustering is that athletes wind up segregated from, rather than integrated into, the general student body. This segregation is reinforced by other restrictions and requirements that are not imposed on students in general, such as oversight of their social media activity and random drug testing. Overall, the segregation of athletes can seriously hinder their ability not only to enjoy the social experience of college, but also to discover through conversation new areas of academic interest and to establish social networks that may be valuable in their professional lives after graduation. In sum, obviously, I believe that even the most generous assessment suggests that the NCAA, as a tool for maintaining the athlete as an integral part of the student body, could be greatly improved. Now recall that according to the NCAA's constitution, achieving this purpose is a way to keep a clear demarcation between intercollegiate athletics and professional sports. In other words, following this logic, we'd expect that if the NCAA isn't doing so great on the educational justice front, and that mission is its way of preventing the professionalization of college sports, it's probably not doing so great on that front either. But we'll take a look. So this is obviously from the NCAA's own website. These icons are the ways that they represent Division I and Division III respectively. So that's from the NCAA's own website, just to be clear. Every year, billions of dollars make their way through a circuit that includes television broadcasting networks and merchandise manufacturers, the NCAA, and university athletic departments and conferences. The rate and magnitude of that commercialization has grown rapidly over the past decade, even as spending on academics has remained stagnant. Between 2004 and 2014 alone, the combined revenues generated by the 48 public institutions in the Power Five conferences, so that includes Michigan, nearly doubled from $2.7 billion to $4.5 billion. During that same decade, spending grew at the same pace, rising from $2.6 billion in 2004 to $4.4 billion in 2014. The largest increases in spending came in expenses paid out for facilities and the salaries of coaches and administrators. This has created what is often described as an arms race of escalating expenditures on athletics. And in the rush to weaponize their athletics programs with big-name coaches, shiny buildings, and skyboxes, the majority of the more than 300 Division I athletic programs lose money, the vast majority. In fact, even the majority of the 200-plus football bowl subdivision, or FBS, and football championship subdivision, FCS, athletic departments lose money. 24 FBS athletic departments, including Michigan's, took in more than they spent. But the average FBS and FCS athletic department lost nearly $13 million annually when comparing revenues to expenses. Even at those 24 schools that do make money, again including Michigan, the surplus comes entirely from football and men's basketball, with the revenues from those sports subsidizing the athletic activities of participants in all other sports. Finally, and this is important, at many schools, though not here at Michigan, more than half of the overall athletic department deficits are offset by hidden fees paid by students. And at dozens of schools, anywhere from 75 to 90% of the athletic department's deficit is covered by such fees. That's from a study in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Obviously doesn't apply to Michigan because Michigan isn't running a deficit. All of this together is what has led economist Andrew Zimbalist to wonder exactly what it means for the NCAA to commit to demarcating a clear line between intercollegiate athletics and professional sports. In his book investigating the question, Zimbalist concluded the following: it is certainly not the presence or absence of commercialism or corporate interests that is the difference between college and professional sports. Rather, two differences stand out. First, unlike their handsomely remunerated coaches and athletic directors, college athletes don't get paid. Second, the NCAA and its member schools, construed to be amateur organizations promoting an educational mission, do not pay taxes on the millions they make from TV deals, sponsorships, licensing, or Final Four tickets. Zimbalist, among many other economists, sociologists, and historians, suggests that far from maintaining a clear line between professional and college sports, the NCAA seems to be operating a vast instrument that fails to deliver on its educational promises while economically exploiting college athletes, since even the most generous estimate of the value of the education and athletic support services they are provided pales in comparison with the revenues generated by their performances. Some object that the athletes have nothing to complain about. They argue that they knew the deal going in, that nobody forced them to sign up, and moreover, that they're living the dream of competing on the biggest stage, under the brightest lights, and in the process using institutions as a stepping stone for future professional careers in which they will earn millions upon millions of dollars. These arguments don't really hold up. Most evidence suggests that recruiters routinely misrepresent the realities of life as an athlete at a Division I school to recruits and their families. Moreover, regardless of whether such misrepresentation occurs, many athletes, especially those in revenue-generating sports, come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in which an athletic scholarship to a prestigious university appears to be the only means to upward social mobility for them and their families. So the matter of how free they really are in making the decision to accept an athletic scholarship could be more complex than many would like to think. Of course, they may very well have dreamed of competing at the college level and have hopes of going pro, but they may understandably not yet fully realize what the reality of competing will be by comparison with their dreams. Finally, as for using college competition as a stepping stone to pro careers, the numbers simply contradict the popular misconception that this happens very often. The entire situation becomes even more disturbing when one considers the overrepresentation of black males on revenue-generating college athletic teams, together with racial disparities in their graduation rates. In view of all of this, we can begin to see why Billy Hawkins, professor of education at the University of Houston, would describe the system maintained by the NCAA and its member institutions as the new plantation.
Howard, a representative from another prestigious institution is here to see you.
A what? Send him in.
Hello, sir. The name is Eric P. Cartman. I'm a well-respected owner in the slave trade.
In the what?
My peaches, what a wonderful office you got yourself, yeah? Certainly got yourself a lucrative business, don't you? Well, let me get right down to it then. Like yourself, I'm also in the slave trade. But at the moment, I find myself in a little quandary with legal issues. Was wondering if you could share some secrets.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
You have some mighty strong-looking workers here, sir. I'd be willing to offer you $40 for 2 of the white ones and $50 for the blacks.
Are you referring to our student athletes?
Student athletes. Oh, that is brilliant, sir. Now, when we sell their likeness for video games, how do we get around paying for our student athletes then?
Look, there are good reasons why our student athletes cannot be paid, young man.
I ain't arguing. If they got paid, then how'd we make all our money, right?
We do not own slaves, and we have no desire to own slaves.
But of course you own slaves because... Oh, right. Of course you don't have desire to own slaves, son. Neither do I. And if there was any government agency listening in on this here conversation, they should know that we're not talking about slave ownership at all. All right, so now how do you get around not paying your slaves?
Get out. This is a prestigious university, and I am not saying one more word to you.
You think you can do whatever you want just because your corporation is a university? This country was founded on the ideas that one corporation couldn't hog all the slaves while the rest of us wallow in poverty. Screw you, sir. I'm going home.
All right. That's satire. So if the NCAA as an organization, which is to say, as a tool, isn't doing what, by its own account, it's supposed to do, then what should we do? And what can we do? Some of you I know are very directly affected by this system, and others who are not quite so directly affected may still be very concerned. And all of you, I imagine, are pretty practically oriented young men and women. So please know that I'm not trivializing your experiences or your sincere desires to know what to do when I say, I don't know what we should do, and I'm not sure what we can do. As one author has put it, it took a civil war to end slavery, decades of mobilizations for women to get the right to vote, and decades more simply to write laws promising civil rights to African Americans. And decades later, we're still very much in the process of trying to realize those promises. So it feels to me like it would be oversimplifying at best and arrogant at worst for me to stand up here pretending that I know how to fix the dysfunctional tool that I believe the NCAA to be. But I do have a few things to say that I hope will get you thinking and talking for yourselves. Beginning with the question I'm sure is on many of your minds, should college athletes be paid? Many today argue that college athletes should be paid, above and beyond the cost of attendance, and in a manner more commensurate with the revenues and prestige their performances generate for the institution. Others counter that it would be impossible to devise a fair system for doing so. I'm not convinced by that counter argument. Our country has a proven track record of solving problems when it is committed to doing so and willing to invest the necessary resources. After all, we've sent a satellite out of the solar system, which is something that I imagine Teddy Roosevelt and others in 1905 would have considered impossible. But it's right there. So it's hard for me to believe that we couldn't figure out a fair way to share billions of dollars in revenues with 100,000 or so students. And for the record, and for what it's worth, I believe it should be done. But I actually don't believe this would solve all the issues that bother me in the way the NCAA and college sports are working. It certainly would not address what concerns me most as an educator, that we admit students, especially, but not only, young black men, into our colleges and universities, and then systematically fail to deliver what we have promised, an opportunity to be educated that is equal to that available to all their peers. But there is more to this than simply reinforcing social inequalities of opportunity, because the ways in which we fail to do so also entail dehumanizing these young men and women, effectively treating them as economic commodities. As such, regardless of what we may say we believe or intend, we effectively treat them as though their bodies' performances are more valuable to us than their minds' potential. So the first thing I would say is that we, faculty members, would do well to keep in mind that the students in our classrooms, whether they are athletes or not, are whole human beings whose potential for growth in every area of life has been entrusted to us. Honoring this trust, in my opinion, forms the only legitimate basis for whatever prestige we have as teachers and our universities as educational institutions. So we should, in my opinion, direct our primary attention to honoring that trust and our efforts to helping our students grow in every way and combating obstacles to that growth when we find them. So for me, this means I'm a member, an active member, of a national coalition of university faculty members, supporting, through research, teaching, and public activities, the empowerment of college athletes. I think that the only solution to this issue that is likely to be durable is one that begins by putting the overall well-being of college athletes, my students, your classmates, you, above all other interests, and that, moreover, respects that principle enough to begin by asking college athletes themselves to talk about those things that hamper their ability to cultivate their own well-being, and then listening to what they say. I say this because perhaps to me the most striking problem in college sports is not economic exploitation or even educational injustice. It is political disenfranchisement. This takes the form of institutional problems or pressures whereby official channels for athletes to express their concerns are restrictive at best. it also takes the form of various unofficial or informal means by which athletes are discouraged from voicing their concerns or even from organizing to discuss them privately amongst themselves. So these are real problems. But the most insidious form that this takes is the internalization by athletes themselves of the belief that they should just be grateful for the opportunity, should just shut up and play, and that they have no power to change their situation. This is the most serious source of the political disenfranchisement of college athletes. So I'm going to leave you then with an example, counterexample, of the 2015 University of Missouri football team. In the fall of 2015, racial incidents on the Missouri campus led student groups to call for administrative action. When this action was not forthcoming, students called for changes in the administration. These calls were also ignored, but came to the attention of members of the football team. Meeting amongst themselves, and then with other student groups, the team publicly threatened not to play their upcoming scheduled game. Within 36 hours, all student demands had been met, including the resignation of top university administrators. 36 hours, one game. It doesn't really matter to me what I think of those demands. What seems important to me about this story is that athletes, in this case together with other students, thought for themselves, hold still, reorganized their power, recognized their power and freedom, and took the courageous step of acting despite the risks and threats of reprisals. Our colleges and universities serve many valid and valuable purposes, but surely foremost among them must be encouraging our students to think for themselves, equipping them with the resources to do so, and then applauding them when they take action to make the world a better place. I can't think of a better example of this than what the University of Missouri football team and their allies in the student body did. And it's significant that to do so, they had recognized their own economic and political power and leveraged it against those who were exploiting them. I actually can't think of a better example of integrating athletics into the educational mission of the university and of integrating the athlete into the general student body. All right, have a good week and a good break. You can